like vision, principles, values, the key competencies are new dimensions of our national curriculum. We need to understand what is required of us in relation to these key competencies, what constitutes good practice. We need to understand perhaps where the notion of key competencies came from in the first place. And above all, we need to develop the ability to critically think through what they mean for practice and what constitutes sensible practice in a school with these key competencies. The requirement is very uncomplicated. It says the school's role is to support students to develop the key competencies. Try to hold that in your head forever, because if you have that as being the defining requirement, it allows you to understand the scope that's available to your school in terms of making decisions about the practice that you will follow. So where did they come from in the first place? Well, I recall at a meeting of the reference group that was overseeing the development of the revised curriculum, somebody coming along one day and talking about key competencies, and everybody getting very excited and saying, oh, we're going to have key competencies in our new curriculum. I went away to investigate, to satisfy my own mind, where this key competencies stuff came from, and found to my satisfaction that it pretty much came from the work that was being done by a European Commission. And this European Commission was doing a lot of exploratory work in order to develop an approach that could be used alongside international surveys, interestingly. Now that group tentatively came up with what they considered to be a set of key competencies. And if you look at the list of 8 that are provided in the slides in this chapter, you'll see that they don't resemble in any manner the competencies that we now have in our revised national curriculum. So to say that they've just been simply copied from a European Commission is to be sadly misinformed. It's not only very helpful to know what is required of us in respect to the key competencies and where they came from, but what they actually mean. If we've got a good understanding of what these competencies actually mean in terms of an educational context, it's going to better advise our thinking about our practice. The Ministry of Education, in one of its early working papers, said that the competencies are integrated, holistic and complex. Now those words take a little bit of working our way through, but essentially what they mean is that they don't just stand on their own. They are interrelated across the curriculum and they're interwoven throughout life, not just the life of the classroom. They said that they are performance-based. They're inferred from action, behaviours and choices. If we take thinking, it's very difficult to know what the thinking is that's going on in a person's head unless we can actually see some observable evidence of through what they are doing. The whole area of thinking is hugely complex. It goes on to say that the competencies relate to a particular context. And school is only one of the contexts in which children live, let alone demonstrate these particular competencies. So, as the Education Gazette statement said in 2006, the key competencies are the capabilities that people need in order to live, learn and contribute as active members of their communities and society. It says they're critical to the sustained learning and effective participation in society and work. Now when we start to get this bigger frame of what the key competency is about, it helps to lift us out of the microclimate of the school and have a bigger view of what it is that we're intending in our role of supporting students to develop the key competencies. I provided some graphical depictions that bring the reality of what can be expected of the school into focus. Berliner's graph, for example, shows that relative to a child's total waking hours, very few of them are actually spent in the school and in classrooms. And yet the key competencies relate to all of those waking hours. There are influences at work on the student in all of those contexts of waking hours, the school being only one part. and to think that you can actually generalise what will happen in the school into the larger part is to be very naive. So some important considerations. The first one I want to emphasise. The key competencies, all of them, are relevant to all learning areas and activities. They don't know any subject boundaries. They are developed simultaneously with the learning areas, the content areas of the curriculum, and the values. If we look at my graphical depiction of the curriculum that shows the learning areas and the key competencies and the values, you can see that in one respect the curriculum is about the substance of learning or the learning for knowledge and skills, and the other dimension is the processes of learning, learning for living and learning for learning itself, having the abilities to be a good learner, the strategies. Now the intention is that somehow we can bring these two into a simultaneous action rather than separate them out. I don't think any school would be silly enough to say, well, we do the thinking key competency at 9 o'clock on Monday mornings and we do the honesty value on Thursday afternoons at assembly at 1 o'clock. Somehow they need to be infused into curriculum action. The New Zealand curriculum, in its section on the key competencies, is non-prescriptive. In other words, it doesn't set out what a school has got to cover in relation to those competencies. Yet it does provide some very good leads in terms of what each competency might involve. In working with some schools, I've heard it said, hey, wait on, there's a lot of stuff there. We need to focus on what the priorities are for our students. We need to identify what they are within each of those. Guy Claxton, in an Education Gazette statement, said that translating curriculum ideals like the competencies into effective teacher practice is an issue grappled with in many countries. Get the process wrong, and it can end up in the scrap heap of ideas that didn't stick. I'd add, get it wrong, and we can get things that stick that do not actually represent the shifts of curricular practice that this revised New Zealand curriculum aspires to. I think there's a rather problematic statement from Guy Claxton when he says teachers need to ensure the competencies come as second nature to young people when needed in real life. Is that realistic? Think about that statement, because it's our ability to think through and analytically judge such statements that can actually lead to better informed practice and thinking about what we do. Because the key competencies are new, because we're having to do a whole lot more learning, a lot of exploration, a lot of clarification, there is always that trap that's available to us. The trap that says, is there a package solution? Has somebody worked out how to do it? Recently visiting a school in Auckland, a teacher said to me, surely you must be seeing a lot of good ideas about how the key competencies are being done in schools around New Zealand that we could actually use in our school. That is to say, hey, we don't want to spend any time learning, developing our professional thought. We just want the package solution. Well, package solutions are the poison of good professional development, practice and learning. Take, for example, this statement here. To achieve the dream, a resource engine is required to drive it. The habits of mind, as developed by Art Costa and Ben Culloch, is a ready-made resource engine for integrating the competencies. I think that Art Costa's stuff is very good, well worth considering. But to say that is the package is to actually do yourself a disservice. All it would show is that you've not been prepared to actually come to grips with what these mean for your students and for your school in a way that is uncomplicated. I mean, there are 16 habits of mind. I ask habits of mind schools, can you just tell me what those 16 habits of mind are from the top of your mind? None has yet impressed me with being able to do that. There is another tip about how we go about deciding what are the priorities. So the competencies are not a separate or standalone part of the curriculum. Moreover, if you look at the different sections of the curriculum, you'll find that words that relate to values, competencies, principles are threaded throughout the document in both the learning areas and in those other dimensions. So what we're really seeking in the design and review of the school's curriculum is a strength that comes when practice, the relationship between practice what is espoused for practice is what teachers are actually doing in their practice. Another problem that schools face in designing and reviewing a curriculum is what I call the multiplier effect. It is so easy to sit down there, to have a workshop day on this and another workshop day on that, and to start multiplying out the statements, the pages, and building up what you might think looks like a very impressive document, but one that perhaps is dubious in terms of how it's actually going to easily resonate in terms of teacher practice. As I've quoted somewhere from somebody, the thicker the plan, the less it's likely to affect practice. Now there is a word of caution for us. One approach is to take a big picture view of the competencies and to say, well, okay, we've done our analysis. 2 of these key competencies, 2 of the 5, are about the cognitive, the intellectual domain, the thinking, the using language, symbols and text, whereas the other 3 are about personal and social domains. Now that gives us a clue if we can start to actually see, make arrangements that allow us to see a bigger picture chunk of things. It gives us a clue as to how we might start to formulate and put together our school's curriculum. Now when it comes to the matter of assessing and reporting the key competencies, we are seeing a lot of very curious practice that's being developed around this country. And a lot of that practice has omitted to actually consider the development of practice from the starting point, and the starting point is a requirement. The requirement is to support students to develop the key competencies. So your obligation is to be able to demonstrate with confidence that you are supporting the students to develop the key competencies. And just having lots of assessments and numbers and grades and levels and checklists is not necessarily the strongest and most compelling evidence of how well those competencies are being developed in truth and in reality. I was showing a design, a model to a group of teachers in Kerikeri, a self-assessment system that students might use. And I had several pages where kids fill out bits and pieces. A teacher from the back of this quite large audience sprang up and she said, "I detest that sort of approach." Now I was impressed that somebody would get up with the courage of her conviction in front of a big audience, or behind the audience actually, to make such an assertive statement. She said, "You come into any of our classrooms and you will see with your eyes that we are developing the intention of these key competencies in our practice. In every reading lesson, for example, we have an element that's concerned with critical thinking, critical analysis of what kids are reading about." Now, that person is at a high level. That is one of the highest levels of demonstrating the competencies at work. Moreover, that person has got the confidence of their practice to be able to stand up and say, this is what you will see in terms of the evidence of us following the spirit and the intention of the key competencies. Well, would we assess the key competencies? That's a matter that every school itself has got to come to grips with. We need to appreciate that assessment is for learning as well as for reporting. But are you going to report on the key competencies? I mean, ask yourself this question. The key competencies that are demonstrated in the school, can you be confident that the student will also demonstrate those in a range of variable life contexts? Not just the student, what about yourself? Moreover, if you're making assessments, who is the judge? Is it the teacher or the student? Now, if you want to have a high level of impact on the students and supporting the students to develop the key competencies, then I would argue that the student has to be central to that process. The student has to, him or herself, know what it is that is a priority for them. For example, in developing my relationship skills with others, what are my priorities? And then being able to reflect on how well I'm doing those things. And doing that reflection not in glorious isolation, but perhaps in a peer-mediated or moderated way. So, in looking at the competencies, you need to have a perspective. Is a perspective that the competencies, that they are the dominant part of your curriculum? I've heard it said that the key competencies could be the drivers of the curriculum. That is to start to swing the pendulum this way or that way. Somehow the best practice is always one of balance. And a balanced approach says the competencies, the values, the learning areas need to work simultaneously. They should each have their share of the valuing of a curriculum approach. I think it is appropriate that teachers can make judgments about children's development of the key competencies in the learning competencies of thinking, problem solving, and the language, symbols and texts dimension. But when it comes to the personal and social competencies, I think there's a strong case for saying the student, him or herself, needs to be central to that process. Bearing in mind that what we see in school, what we do in school, may not necessarily generalise into life beyond school, and that, of course, is why we're developing the competencies in the first place, for life not at school, but for life in general. We provide some examples in this chapter of different approaches adopted by schools that we hope each school will critically review in reaching its own position. But one of these models, headed Getting On With Others, shows what looks rather like a web. In this particular one, the criteria, I listen to what others say to me, I speak nicely to others, were actually generated by a class of Year 4 students, facilitated and supported by their teacher. And what happens is that the students make their own judgments about how they are actually performing in relation to these. So they'll plot themselves, but it's not a finalised plotting until they've actually had it validated by some of their peers. So in this particular classroom I visited at Karori Normal School, what happens is that the child can sit down with a friend and one other person who may not be a friend in the classroom and say, well, look, this is where I think that I am on here. Do you agree with me? And then some very interesting discussion arises from that. It's not about absolutes or fixed points. It's about the reflection. It's about the discussion. It's about seeing ourselves as others see us against a broad spectrum of criteria that focus not just on the setting of the school, but on the settings of life in itself. We've got habits of mind, long lists. Somehow we need to come down to a bigger picture view. So when it comes to thinking, for example, a big picture view might be, well, thinking has got 3 interrelated components: critical analytic thinking, creative thinking, and reflective thinking. Let's forget the old de Bono's hats, they're gathering dust. Let's think of an MP3. Mind processes 3. First mind process, critical thinking. Second mind process, creative thinking. Third mind process, reflective thinking. Then we provide students with great contexts for how they actually understand their own approaches to their learning.